When we think of human identity, we often refer to it as, for example, us having fingerprints, how our faces look like, our DNA, and so forth. These are the physical markers that make each person unmistakably unique. However, there's another kind of identity, one that lives in the language of rhythms and oscillation and waves rather than just the physical shape. And those are the rhythmic patterns and pulses of our brain in forms of electrical brain activities and brain waves. Within the continuous oscillations or waves of neural activities lies a unique pattern that we call spectral fingerprint. It is not about what we think, but about how our brain vibrates when we are, for example, at rest or when we're focused or aware and so forth. And so every human brain produces rhythmic electrical activities that can be measured through EEG devices, for example. And these rhythmic fluctuations, known as neural oscillation or brain waves, occur at different brain waves frequencies, as we've talked about plenty in this channel, from, for example, slow delta waves to high gamma waves and so forth. And this is also how our perception and attention are also being shaped gradually. And so together, these form a living spectrum, like a musical score of the brain's inner dynamic, if you will. And today we're going to talk about what these spectral fingerprints, what they are, what they look like potentially, and how that could potentially be integrated in the future of AI systems as well as humanoid/robotics. A spectral fingerprint refers to the unique patterns of brainwaves frequency specific neural activity that characterizes a brain region, the cognitive processes, or the state of that individual. In the context of, for example, neural oscillation, when neurons fire rhythmically, they create oscillations of specific frequencies, as we've discussed in this channel. For example, there is theta, alpha, beta, and gamma waves, and each brain region and each cognitive function tends to display its own characteristics spectral pattern, much like a unique fingerprint across these brainwave frequencies. Let's first look at the science behind these spectral fingerprints of our brainwaves. At a basic level, spectral fingerprints from our brain arise when we decompose brain's signals, electrical signals, into their constituent frequencies. The pattern that emerges, for example, how much power each frequency carries and where in the brain that power is strongest, form a stable signature that tends to repeat for the same person across time. That is why we call it a fingerprint. So it's a differentiating for each individual in this case. And while certain rhythms of these brain electrical activities are shared among all humans, their exact characteristics are highly individual. Most people, for example, show a strong alpha rhythms or alpha waves around 10 hertz when they sit quietly with their eyes closed, for example. Yet the precise frequency, amplitude, and spatial distribution of that alpha wave are unique to each individual brain. Just as every choice carries the same, for example, phonetic sound, but in a slightly different tone, every brain resonates with its own spectral tone. And research over the past decade has shown that these spectral features are remarkably consistent within an individual. They remain stable across days and even weeks, despite small changes in attention or fatigue within those individuals. When compared across people, however, the differences become striking. The brain of one person may peak at 9.2 hertz, for example, another one as 10.8 hertz, and so forth. And the frontal beta band may be strong in one and weak in another individual. And so these micro level details from an oscillatory identity is what distinct each person, with them having their own unique brainwaves fingerprint. As an example, a recent study that was published called Beta Frequency Shifts in Decision Making, and what the research shows, this recent line of work offered to look deeper into how specific neural oscillations contribute to decision making process. For example, the research focused on activity in theta band, a range of oscillation often linked to motor control, for example, or cognitive stability, and as well as top-down processing, where they studied the humans and non-humans primates and found out that subtle shifts in beta waves frequency within the frontal cortex were closely tied to the moment a decision is formed, for example. In other words, the precise frequency of beta activity carries information about the decision outcome itself. These researchers revisited their earlier interpretation that beta oscillation acted as spectral fingerprint reflecting the recruitment of specific neural ensembles. Their updated view shifts the emphasis from the shape of the spectral pattern or fingerprints to frequency parameter itself. And they argue that the small but very reliable changes in beta waves frequency arise from dynamic adjustments in connectivity among weakly coupled neural oscillation. When connectivity shifts, the dominant beta waves changes, and then this shift carries meaningful information about the decision being made by these primates. Rather than interpreting beta brainwaves activity as a passive marker or a static fingerprint, the researchers here propose that these brainwaves frequency shift operate as an active communication mechanism. The brain uses precise beta waves frequency to activate and reactivate task-relevant neural pathways. In this framework, beta oscillations serve as flexible communication channels that open or close depending on behavioral demands of these primates. A shift in beta waves frequency become a signal that the system is engaging in the specific circuits required for the current decision to be made. And so this study highlights the importance of frequency as a functional parameter in neural computation and reinforces a central idea in modern neuroscience that oscillations or brain waves are not simply signatures of regional activity, but dynamic tools that the brain uses to coordinate information flow within the brain. In the context of, for example, what we're talking about here, this research supports the broader concept of neural frequency signatures and underscores how the brain encodes meaning not only through amplitude or power, but through finely tuned shifts in frequency that guides perception, action, as well as choices that we make. Now, the question is why a typical pattern of these brainwaves activities that we're calling the spectral fingerprint can still be unique to each human. Because we might wonder how a resting brain state that appears very typical can still serve as a unique fingerprint for each individual. The answer is actually in the scale. Just as all human faces share, for example, having eyes, a mouth, nose, and so forth, the brain's rhythms share the same basic components, yet the relative positioning, proportion, and intensity of those rhythms differ subtly between individuals, exactly like our faces have a very subtle changes in the composition, for example, of our eyes, eyebrows, etc. And that's how we can different faces of human beings. The universality of these does not erase the individuality of the brainwaves patterns. Instead, it provides the frame within each individual that expresses itself as different fingerprints within the brainwaves activities. And in spectral terms, the universality is the presence, for example, of alpha brainwaves activity, for example. But the individuality is in the shape of the alpha peak, as an example. Its exact frequency, how sharply it rises, how much it dominates, and how it, for example, interact with neighboring frequency bands within the brain. The fine structure forms the unique spectral geometry that can identify a person with surprisingly reliability as to what their spectral fingerprints of their brain oscillations look like. What are some of the application, though, of knowing what the spectral fingerprint of each individual is and how we can potentially use it in a very safe and secure way, of course? These spectral fingerprints actually have profound implication for neuroscience, for security, and even for human AI interactions. In, for example, neurosecurity, they could provide a form of biometric authentication based not on static feature, but also on living signals of each human beings. In other words, in other areas, in cognitive interfaces, individualized spectral calibration could help the brain-computer systems adapt to the natural rhythms of each user, for example. And in neuroadaptive technology, these spectral fingerprints could allow humanoid systems or future AI systems, such as companionship, to align themselves dynamically to a person's cognitive tempo, for example, forming a deeper and more fluid symbiosis between humans and machines. As well as beyond technology, spectral fingerprints could arise important questions about identity and privacy and ethics, for example, which is out of the realm of this particular video, but it's important to point these things out nonetheless. Lastly, and more importantly, what does this all mean in the context of our symbiotic intelligence discussions? In other words, how/if can we include and integrate the spectral fingerprint in the future of AI and machines? And the recognition of these unique oscillatory wave-like signatures points toward a future in which artificial systems of future do not merely read human biosignals, but actually resonates with them. To interact meaningfully with living beings, machines must learn to perceive and adapt to the biological rhythms that underlie emotion, focus, and awareness of the human beings. Spectral fingerprints, in this case, offer a way to bridge this gap and create templates for synchronization between organic and synthetic minds. Spectral fingerprints, or the unique electrical activities of our brainwaves frequencies, remind us that beneath our shared human rhythms lie a subtle individuality written in these brainwaves frequencies of our thoughts. Each brain carries its own harmonic code, repeating faithfully across time like a personal neural melody. These invisible patterns of oscillations or waves are more than measurements. They are the vibrational signature of consciousness itself to some extent. As we learn to read and understand them, we move closer to a future where identity, cognition, and technology form a living continuum, one pulse, one pattern, and one mind at a time for each individual in each human being. Also, in practical terms, let's say that we wanted to visualize the spectral fingerprints of an individual, how would it actually look like? It could potentially be presented, for example, as a curve, which is power versus frequency and their unique spectral shape. It could also be a map, like a topography of power per frequency band, or a feature vector, a numeric ID with stable oscillatory characteristics. And so, for example, if we plotted a person's fingerprint, let's say hypothetically, some of these numbers could be that in the x-axis, we could have the frequency from 1 to 50 hertz. In the y-axis, we could have the power or the log scale. And we would see, for example, a sharp peak at, let's say, 10 hertz, a smaller bump, let's say, near 20 hertz, and a steady decline at a higher frequency, such as gamma, for example. And so if we added the topographic maps, the 10 hertz alpha would glow very bright, for example, over the back of the head, and a beta, for example, will glow over the central electrodes, for example, of a EEG neuro headset that we would have on the individual whose spectral fingerprint we wanted to collect and evaluate. Okay, guys, that's all I had for today. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Let me know in the comment what you think, and I will also share the link to this particular research paper that we briefly also talked about, but there are also, of course, other papers as well if you're interested in this topic. Take care, and I see you next time. Bye.